Hey everybody, this is Eric Porter, and I'd like to welcome you all to Let's Jam episode 3. And in the co-captain's chair is Mr. Peter Connors, author of a book we're going to be discussing today, JAMerica. And as you all know, this is the Jam Band show. So, Peter, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be
Absolutely.
here.
And I just wanted to go over a few new releases that we've got coming out. One of my favorite bands, Squeaky Feet, as much live material as they have. They're actually just released their Spring Tour 2025 show. I'm not sure if that's a collection from different shows or if it's one show, but any of you who've been to their website know that they put a lot of their stuff out there. So check that one out. One that we missed last month was the Spin Doctors Face Full of Cake. I believe that came out in April, early April. Leftover Salmon has Let's Party About It. That was a May release. And lastly, we have the band Spofford. They have Live Wax Volume 4 that came out also in May. I didn't see any other June releases, so I'm not sure if we have anything else coming up. And just as a reminder to everyone, uh, Peter and I are both New Yorkers, but if anyone is near upstate New York, we've got the Rock the Dock Festival going on in Lake George on July 12th, and that is going to feature Humphreys McGee. So make sure to check that out. A lot of shows coming this summer. Peter, I'm sure we'll talk about a few of the festivals that are out there. So again, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And Peter, I think probably the best way to start this, I read your book, loved it. The book contains a ton of interviews with various, members of the Jam community. And why don't you just give us a background? Peter and I have a little connection. We both went to SUNY Potsdam, which is way upstate New York, and just kind of missed each other in our times there. But give us a background on how you got into this and the evolution. Obviously, you've written some books about the Dead. You've kind of an aficionado on the Dead, so I'd love to hear your backstory.
Sure. So I will say thank you for having me. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I love geeking out about music, so I'm happy to chat with you. As far as my background, the first like sort of bigger book that I had published, because I also write poetry and things like that, but it was called Growing Up Dead: The Hallucinated Confessions of a Teenage Deadhead. And that is the sort of backstory, which is essentially getting into the Dead as a young teenager and going to see them for the first time at Kingswood Music Theater in June of 1987, and then just getting bit, and going to shows after that, and sort of, going to school and dropping out of school and living out of a van, and all the things that deadheads do, and just going to as many shows as I can. And so that was, that was my sort of entree into music. But I grew up in the 70s. I was born in 1970. And I had two older brothers and an older sister. So, music was such a huge part of my life growing up, and not, jam band stuff per se, but everything, just Boston, Styx, Kansas, Frampton. I mean, you name it, anything you can think like that's the 1970s, that was my life. And as a word person, as a writer, I always really focused on lyrics. And so from a really young age, I could lip sync all the songs and stuff like that. So music has always been huge to me. But it was kind of like that was like my siblings' music, And when I found the Grateful Dead, for whatever reason, everything in me just synced right to it, and I knew it was my stuff. And then, of course, when you meet people and you start going to Dead shows, you realize, there's people like you out there. You join that tribe, and it felt very much like home, for me right from the start. And so that was, that's how I got into music and touring and the jam band scene, as it were. And then in the early 90s, when I was at Potsdam, we were actually in a really, although we were like way up there in the north, we were in a weirdly good position for this sort of, okay, I'm going to say the first wave of jam bands, because I really think the Grateful Dead are their own entity. And then we have Fish, Widespread Panic, Blues Travelers, Spin Doctors, Aquarium Rescue, you name it, the list goes on and on, um, that were coming at that time out in the early 90s and had this force, and it was sort of typified by the H.O.R.D.E tour, which really collected all these bands. But the bands individually were playing college campuses. They were playing at St. Lawrence University frat house, and they were playing. The first time I saw Fish was on Earth Day at Potsdam, and I believe it was '91, and it was free. They played in our hall. We carried in their equipment. I carried in the trampolines. I carried in the vacuum. Just they were just a band that was out touring. But I will tell you, from the minute they started playing, because all my friends were musicians at Crane School of Music, and I was learning guitar. From the minute they started playing, it was like I felt like this was something new, and I mean, it was really palpable, like a new wave was coming.
That's awesome.
And for me, it was really exciting because I had spent the past several years going to Dead shows. I was a really big Brent Midland fan, and when he passed away, that was pretty tough. And it sort of took the wind out of my sails, and I kept going to shows. But I was really ripe for something new, and also something a little smaller scale that was more manageable. And, now all of a sudden we're going to see these amazing new bands, not much older than us, in bars, paying $10 to go see them. They seem to know each other, which in JAMerica I flesh out more of how that actually happened. But it was like, here's a new community. And the interesting thing was when my friends and I started going to Dead shows in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, it was like, we were jumping on something that had been around already for 20 years at that point. For this, it's like we were the older ones, like coming in and sort of, and starting up. And I remember specifically Fish playing at St. Lawrence University outside on this little field, and there was a handful of people and just like little ropes roping things off. But I remember Trey, like seeing Trey see us. And we were freaks, and everybody, dreadlocked out and the whole thing, just, a bunch of dirty hippies loving the music. And I remember the look on his face. That he was digging that we were digging it. And it was almost like I think everybody was kind of glimpsing the future in that moment, what was to come. And I'm thrilled that, they've taken off like they have, and it's gotten to be such a juggernaut. And it's been cool to see the subsequent waves of musicians who've picked up this legacy and made their own thing with it.
Cool. Well, two things from what you just said. My sister saw Fish when she was going to SUNY Plattsburgh, and I don't know if people know Fish, Vermont based at the time that they started. So I missed them obviously at Potsdam, Peter, but that's great that they played the school and like you said, St. Lawrence University. But I think something else you said that was interesting that you touch on in your book was you made that what felt to be a connection between you and Trey as they were playing and you were in the audience. And one of the things you point out in your book, I think one of the things maybe I don't want to say a definition of jam band, but the one of the things you talk about is and even the musicians talk about is how important the fans are to them as well and playing live. And I can't remember who I was reading in one of the interviews in the book, but I mean, they basically said there are times where the audience drives the show. You got a good charged up audience. It does that for them too. But how did that feel? I mean, it's like you said, you're loading and unloading these guys maybe a couple years later. I'm trying to remember when Picture of Nectar came out because I think that was kind of my first connection with Fish. That's I
Mhm.
think it's early 90s, maybe 92, 93. So you kind of saw them just before they really hit. I mean, you were seeing them coming up. So
Yeah.
what was that
Yeah.
like for you?
Lawn Boy was the album that really, I was listening to around that time. And I think Picture Nectar was a little bit after, but, Lawn Boy I thought was fantastic. And again, it was just like this just new wave. It was just exciting, you know what I mean? And I still get excited thinking about it. There were this little festival at Arrowhead Ranch that Fish headlined. It was a couple days, but yeah, everybody was at this festival. A lot of the bands that we talked about, and the Radiators were there and stuff like that. But it was the most low key scene. I literally don't think there was security there. You know what I mean? And so to go from what the Dead scene had become, which was, big, giant places or just intense security and busts and all these different things, to like, oh my God, this music is amazing. And it doesn't cost me an arm and a leg. And there's no security and everybody's just chilling out. And um, absolutely, I think that the musicians of the jam band scene, it's almost a given, like there has to be that connection with the audience, or else in some ways you're not a jam band. If you're not sort of riding the wave with the audience, and paying attention to how the audience is reacting, that's a part of the improvisational spirit of the whole thing. And it happens in that moment. And so if a band takes the audience out of that equation, the improvisational element is only about half. That's just musicians playing to other musicians, which is fine. But I really think that that aspect, what makes a jam band is to bring the audience into that. And all of these bands, were doing that. And here's the thing, they were all coming as fans, big music fans to start with,
Sure.
and fans of the music that influenced them, like the stuff from the 60s that was very improvisational. Whereas those bands from the 60s were being influenced by, the roots stuff, right? The bluegrass and blues and all these things that didn't necessarily have that aspect of expanding a song to 20 minutes. Well,
Sure.
these guys were the first generation, of the jam band, but they were influenced by the original, acid rock bands and psychedelic bands and all that stuff. So the blueprint was there. And the blueprint was there on how to relate to the fans by what the Grateful Dead had set forth.
So in saying that, so like what you were saying, even though you were seeing the Dead had already been around for a number of years, so you kind of felt these new bands, I guess, that were coming in, it probably is the first wave of jam bands because I don't think people referred to the Dead back in the 70s as a jam band, right? It was just you're going to see the Dead or you're going to see the Almonds. So along with Fish, what were some of the other bands maybe that you saw coming up that are now, you know, the
Yeah.
the top of the line guys, I guess.
Well, you said the Spin Doctors, and it's like, there's a bunch of bands that sort of, some of them made their mark really through MTV, that happened to catch that wave.
Right.
And so they became known in that way, but haven't had the same sort of career that Fish have had, which is outside of that mainstream. I think maybe Chalk Dust Torture was played, for 5 minutes on MTV with a video or something, but they've obviously done okay for themselves outside
Very
of that.
well.
And then you have the bands who, did, I think Blues Traveler is a great example, and Spin Doctors had actually crossed over into the pop market and, have always been very still attached to the jam band scene, but also had a Dave Matthews Band, same thing,
Yep.
had very, this great pop success. But in what it comes down to it, Dave Matthews Band is a jam band. You know what I mean? At its heart, he can just write really good pop songs too,
Sure.
And so those bands that I just named, but I really, Aquarium Rescue Unit was one of my favorites, and we lost Colonel Bruce Hampton. Bless him. He was just a unique soul in this world, and maybe beyond this world. And there's all sorts of great Colonel Bruce stories. But I've seen 8 different Sphere shows now with Dead and Company, and one of my real treats is to see O'Teal up there because he was, of course, the bassist for Aquarium Rescue Unit,
Yep.
and so to see him go through all the phases that he has all these years, and be able to go see him now playing up on this huge stage. And I don't know, that's really cool. Just to digress for a second, there's these great stories about Colonel Bruce would go up to O'Teal and go into the different band members, and he would just, while they were playing solos and stuff, just detune their instruments. And it wasn't to just screw with them, although I'm sure it sort of, gave him some humor, but he wanted to make you step out of your expected, this is what I do now, this is what I do now, and this is how this night will go. Like, there, I'm going to detune you, now deal with that, just to make sure that everything was weird enough and you were
Sure.
challenged enough and you didn't fall into any patterns. So when I see O'Teal playing with Dead and Company, I'm like, I think of those things.
Absolutely.
But that was those are good examples. And the Radiators were playing a lot. I mean, there were all sorts of bands, and there were these sort of like next level bands that were also playing a lot. That were like Blind Man's Holiday was around on the East Coast, and I mean, I could go on and on. There were bands that sort of never got known beyond that. But we're fantastic, and we're playing with these bands, and a lot of times playing on double bills or supporting them and opening and stuff, and could have jumped off, in that way, but just for whatever reason didn't.
Sure. Now you mentioned the Horde Festival. It's talked about a lot in your book.
Yeah.
I assume that was kind of the groundswell when that wave came through and it ran for a number of years. And I think, like you said, you had all those bands, Blues Traveler, I think were kind of right. They kind of generated, was it Popper and those guys that kind of generated it? Um, but now, and you mentioned the Arrowhead Ranch, there's festivals everywhere. I mean, I think we're lucky where we live. they're all over the place. Hudson Valley. I know Buffalo is a huge spot for music, and I assume, same goes for the bigger areas, Rochester, Albany. We get a ton of shows in Albany. We've got the festival in Lake George. Um, did you see the Horde Festival? Were you at a bunch of those? And maybe talk about that experience when all those bands came together and played.
Yeah, for sure. I went to a bunch of the Horde shows at that time, and they had different lineups and different years, but the core was pretty solid there, and it did. As you mentioned, I talk a lot about it in the book,
Yep.
but John Popper was really driving that, and Trey was certainly instrumental in that, as was Chris Barron from the Spin Doctors. But behind all that, there was David Graham, who there's a very famous promoter that Deadheads will certainly know as Uncle Bobo, and Bill Graham, who was a great promoter of the Grateful Dead on both coasts, mainly on the West Coast, but also did a whole lot on the East, and is just a king of the business. His son David managed and organized a lot of these shows, put them together in the very early days of the jam band scene, especially around New York City where he was, including the Spin Doctors and Blues Traveler. And he was instrumental in those Arrowhead Ranch shows. He might have even owned Arrowhead Ranch, and I don't want to misspeak, but anyway, he was certainly key in putting those together, and no doubt in the Horde 2, which was kind of the next step after Arrowhead Ranch. And in some ways, it was kind of the crowning moment of that scene before, everybody was all those bands could then command their own spaces. They didn't need to come together to sell out a shed or whatever. But they weren't quite there yet, I think, when Horde happened. So they really, and again, in this way of like building community, they gave each other that leg up to get these big audiences in. And then, it went out from there. And the shows were fantastic. If you like that kind of music, again, it was, reasonably priced. You could get a ticket. You could see, bands that you knew like this, and then get exposed to some new bands. And it was very similar to like Lollapalooza, which was happening then, but just completely different genre of music. Same idea, it was just a lot. And then there was like the Lilith Fair, and different things like that. A lot of these musicians realized that they could organize their own, tours. They could organize their own festivals, I should say, bring their friends in, and it was really brilliant. It was really brilliant. And of course, after that, Fish went on to do all their big festivals, which have now become a tradition with them. And they don't need anybody else playing there, and so they don't. um, but that's where that started. And in fact, Arrowhead Ranch, I'd say in a lot of ways was the first Fish festival. I know there was Amy's Farm before that, but it was kind of a backyard, and Arrowhead was a little bit more formal in that way, just a little.
So,
I can debate fish heads about
exactly.
that.
So with that, with the festivals and everything, and like you said, for some reason I never made that connection that Horde was kind of, with Lollapalooza and everything else. Those really kind of keyed those up. What I found interesting was I had a couple friends who were really big into the Dead growing up, and it was the tape collections, and a lot of that is also talked about in the book, how the trading shows and now, like, with the internet, it's exploded. I mean, I talked about Squeaky Feet, who's one of the bands that I really like that are out there now, but I remember him having like wine cases full of tapes. And now, obviously, they're putting these shows out online where you can download the shows. Um, I'm sure pretty much everything is recorded direct to the board at this point. You're not having somebody sitting out there taping a show, so the qualities are great. But that sense of community. So the Dead were able to do that prior to all this technology, right? I mean, like you said, it did feel like a community. People just went and hung out, spent the day. I enjoyed the part, I think it was Dave Navarro or Steve Perkins with Dave Navarro, how they would just go to the show. Navarro brings his guitar and Perkins brings his bongos, and they're walking through the parking lots and just meeting people and hanging out. So even though the Dead was able to do that prior to this, what do you think the internet possibly has done or has done with a lot of these new bands? Do you think that connection is even stronger, or is it just a different way that people are doing it these days?
Well, it's interesting. So those bootlegs that you were talked about, in the Deadhead community, those were, I would consider those a currency. and almost, they were traded almost like money. And part of the policy is that people didn't sell. You never sold a bootleg. That would be considered really taboo. But you certainly could trade them and trade them for other ones or trade them for other goodies, that you might want. And there was this idea of generations of sound. So you wanted the closest, to first generation sound board that you could get. And so there was good sounding tapes, there was bad sounding tapes, there was hard to get tapes, there were tapes that everybody had, which was part of the story of Cornell 77, which I also wrote a book about. There was a great sounding tape that was readily available to many people, and it turned a lot of people on. But it was a currency, it was something to be coveted and shared, and it was a way to come together too. And it was sort of certainly outside of the mainstream. So I think, one thing that's perhaps lost in the internet having everything available is there's no currency anymore. Anybody can click that and listen to it. And that's okay. You know what I mean? I think it's amazing. I will say I just went down a deep 1969 Grateful Dead like rabbit hole for the past 2 days, and I literally just texted I have this friend group called the Bus that we were all toured together, and I said everything that's not 69 Dead sounds like dog shit. And I'm just, so that's where I'm at right now. I
You're in
literally
that
tried to
zone.
listen. I tried to listen to something else, and I'm like, no, I can't do it. Like so that's a blast. It's so fun, and all these things we worked so hard to try and get are now available there, or they're all cleaned up and released officially and stuff like that. And I've certainly got turned on to a bunch of new music through, archives.org or through re-listen, as a different medium and so forth. So, yeah, I think it's amazing. And I mean, it's what a way for bands to get known. The Dead, people think the Dead had this great master plan of like we're going to let people tape and then they're going to trade in, and they didn't. It was almost accidental, as many things were with the Grateful Dead. It was sort of like stumbled into. And again, that's a whole story that I tell in Cornell 77 in that book. So I won't go into it. But at the end of the day, this idea of the moment happens, the improvisation, the music that's played that night happens, and then you give it away for people to listen to is absolutely a blueprint laid down by the Grateful Dead. And it's almost a definition now of what a jam band does.
So what about like of the newer bands, or let's say, what are you discovering now and what are you listening to now? Obviously, we all go back and listen to the stuff we love that never goes away. But are there any new bands now that really are exciting you or that you're into?
Yeah, I mean, I try and stay really open, and I have some friends who will just say, send me something I've never heard before. And I'm not even going to be able to tell you those names because honestly, I just like, I'll listen. And even if I dig it, I may not go back to it,
Mhm.
but I like to keep mixing it up. I mean, as much as some people are going to give me shit about it, like, I really like Goose. And I know that's like in the scene, some people are like, lukewarm, or I think they're fantastic. I'm going to see them this weekend.
Oh,
By the
nice.
way, I don't know when this is airing, but I also have tickets to Mountain Jam Festival that I actually have to sell because of my daughter's graduation. So if anyone wants, I have 3 day passes to Mountain Jam, two of them, and parking that are now for sale, and they're on cash and trade. So anyway, but a lot of the bands there, I had never heard of Mount Joy, and then I saw them, so I listened to them, and it's like some music I really liked on there. I didn't, it's you kind of only get to have one first love.
True.
So it's tough when it's the Grateful Dead and you compare everything against it. Because again, I can say I like this band, I like this band, and I do, but then I listen to, some 69 shows and everything sounds like shit and it sounds awful. You know what I mean? So that's my bias, And but I will say I listen to Goose a lot. I really like the live releases that they put out. And I listen to, some of the more recent shows too, just to see what they're doing. I think they're really interesting. I think they're good songwriters. I think the songwriting keeps improving. I think the interplay between the band members is really impressive and full of dynamics that are super engaging. I saw them a few shows at the Capitol Theater. I saw them in Syracuse, and I'm looking forward to seeing them next weekend. So I'm sure I will keep listening and following what they do.
Cool. Any now, unfortunately, you're having to give up those tickets. Are there any festivals or that you're hitting this summer that you want to make mention of or excited about?
Well, I'll say so. I'm in Rochester, New York, and we're really fortunate around here to have a lot of good shows that happen in the summer. It's like it'll be kind of dead for a few months in the winter because nobody wants to go to Rochester and play in the winter, and I don't blame them. So what happens though is in spring we have CMAC as a venue in Canandaigua. There's a bunch of good shows there. That's where Goose is playing. So I'll see shows there. We have the Rochester International Jazz Festival starts in about a week, and there's tons of music there. And again, Trombone Shorty usually plays. There's bands that jam band fans might
And
be familiar with, but tons of other bands and jazz musicians that it's like, if you like this kind of music,
yeah,
you're probably going to find something to like there. And then we have a lot of outdoor festivals. There's Party in the Park and there's Bands on the Bricks, all sorts of smaller things that are either free or $10. And Dark Star Orchestra always plays here during the summer. So I have tickets to go see them. They're playing at something called the Hoochie Festival, which is the first year for the Hoochie Festival. But so this is essentially in my backyard. It's right across the street from my house. It's in a park. Dark Star Orchestra, Humphreys McGee, and Galactic are all playing on the same day, and it's basically a park across the street from my house at this Hoochie Festival.
that's awesome.
So it's a bit of an embarrassment of riches. And that same weekend, Joe Russo's Almost Dead is playing two nights in another suburb that's like 15 minutes away.
That's
So
fantastic.
it's, there's a lot. If you like this kind of music, like every weekend, starting probably next weekend, I will be seeing something and there's something to see. And so I'm not leaving town. I was psyched for Mountain Jam. I've been to it before. But family takes precedence and my daughter's graduation comes first. So
I hear
that's
you.
that's part of growing up. Sometimes you got to pick that.
I'm actually doing the Jazz Fest in Saratoga, the 28th and 29th. Trombone Shorty's playing at that one. Gladys. So
So fun.
get
Oh
to
yeah,
see
let
them.
us start playing here too. Yep. Uh-huh.
Okay. And then, you mentioned Humphreys McGee, they're playing here, and I can't remember if Galactic's on that bill or not, but they're here in July. So I'll be seeing them. And Fish is coming. I want to say end of July. I'm seeing one of the three shows.
It's
Same thing.
Saratoga.
Yep, Saratoga, Dave
Oh.
Matthews, we're doing one of those.
Mhm.
And Tedeschi Trucks and Government Mule, we're going to see them. So, like you said, I don't know if it's our region. I know these bands are out touring all the time, but there's like you said, almost every weekend you can see something.
Yeah, Melvin Seals comes here quite a bit, so it's been fun seeing him again, little venues with John Kadlicek, who I think is a fantastic guitar player, and used to go see him with Further and obviously with Dark Star Orchestra before that. But I thought Further was fantastic. I mean, they were a great band too, and so he's as far as this kind of music, like he's amazing, and it's great to see Melvin.
Cool.
So yeah, I mean, it just keeps going. It's really
We're lucky.
incredible. It's
Yeah.
incredible. Yeah, it's so rich, and I'm so grateful to have an ear for this kind of music because once you let it in and once it's a part of your life, as long as you're open to, going out and checking out a new band who maybe you've never heard of, but maybe is going to be in that same vein, it just keeps going and expanding. And I don't understand people who shut that down, and it's like like I only do this or I only listen to this. Like that's unfortunate, man, because there's a whole lot of good stuff out there still happening.
Awesome. I love that quote. So why don't we'll end it there, Peter. I want to thank you for being on. Do you have anything you'd like to promote?
I will
Anything?
mention, so my first novel came out pretty recently. It's called Merch Table Blues, and it's basically the premise is it's a band that's touring these kind of clubs out of Burlington,
Okay.
and I call it a sex, drugs, and rock and roll murder mystery. And you're in the eyes of a roadie, and you're seeing these things happen in the band touring. So if you're into music and all that stuff, that's great. And if you're into sort of like the murder mystery tension of that, it's got that too.
Love to. And your website is www.
PeterConnors.net, and it's CONNERS, PeterConnors.net.
And check out his book and books. But Peter, I'd love to have you back. I wish we had more time. I think I'd like to hear your touring stories actually too. That sounds like that could be a blast. So,
Anytime.
but I appreciate it. And like I said, Chris will be back next month with us. But Peter, you're welcome anytime. So stay in touch and I'll be reaching out to you because just from talking with you today, I heard a bunch of things. I'm like, oh, we could go further with that. So I'd love to have you back at some point, but enjoy the summer, enjoy the shows. Hopefully everyone else is out there getting to them and kind of like Peter said, open the mind up a little bit and just give everything a shot because what's better than music and new music or discovering new music is always a thrill. So thanks everyone. That is Let's Jam for June. We'll be back in July. Like I said, Chris will be back. He's on tour with the Almond Betts Band. I believe he's done at the end of the month. So we may get some tour stories from Chris as well. So take care, everybody. Thanks for watching Let's Jam, and we will see you in July. Take care.